Want to stay ahead in the evolving energy industry? Visit EnergyLawInsights.com to explore Troutman Pepper Locke's cutting-edge analysis, comprehensive services, and more. From navigating unexpected challenges to evaluating new opportunities, we help market leaders and innovators succeed. Troutman Pepper Locke, leading the energy evolution. Hello and welcome back to the Troutman Pepper Battery and Storage Podcast. I am your host, Bill Derasmo, partner at Troutman Pepper Locke. Today, I am pleased to have with me Dr. John Busbee, the CEO of Xerion Advanced Battery Corporation. And that is Xerion with an X. And for the audience, you can go to xerionbattery.com. Welcome to the program, John.
Thank you. I've enjoyed your podcast episodes. I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. You'll be the first episode for 2025, so we're pleased to have you. Great to have you on today. You're the CEO at Xerion, as I mentioned, and you have been since 2013. Before coming to Xerion, you spent 21 years in the U.S. Air Force. Why don't you tell us about your journey from a long military career and now more recently with Xerion, and then I want to discuss Xerion's story.
Yeah, that's great. I spent most of my career from undergraduate onward in the Air Force, as you said, and specifically in the Air Force Research Labs, where I ran an intelligent processing control group. So we were doing AI 30 years ago when it wasn't called AI, and people thought we were kind of quacks for doing it. Shows that you need to be timely in the technology. I think it's a lesson for today as well. But in around the 99-2000 timeframe, I became the first program manager of nanotechnology for the Air Force. And, there was a lot of hype about nanotechnology, just like there is in the battery space today. So there were, money frequently follows hype. And there was a lot of money. I was given a lot of money through that job, that I had discretion to give it to people doing that work. And so a lot went to universities, but we funded a lot of small companies. And my service in the government as a civilian and military is exactly what it is. It's service. And, I believe passionately in making sure you're serving for the better good. And, as I was doing that, I just got bit by the entrepreneurial bug. And I felt like I was fake. And that I had finished my service, that I was comfortable. I don't believe to really maximize what you're supposed to do in life. You're supposed to be comfortable. And so I decided to start a company. And I wanted it to be based on nanotechnology, and I wanted it to be based in manufacturing, and specifically domestic manufacturing, because I thought we had made a real mistake sending all of our manufacturing overseas. My dad spent 40 years as a manufacturing engineer. And so I was passionate about manufacturing domestically. I was passionate about nanotechnology, but I'm most passionate about making a difference. And being in the military for so long, I wanted to make a difference for the military people on the other side, but I want to make a difference for society in general. So I decided that day that I was going to go start a company. The question, and it wasn't a battery company, it was a company that would make a difference. And so that was the focus. And so then the question became, okay, where can we have the most impact? And so our company came about. I did my PhD at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Paul Braun is one of the professors there who happened to be my advisor. And, I had done my PhD. The Air Force had sent me for that. I'd been back at the Air Force. And Paul's the one that found the first technology that we commercialized the company around, which was a there's the nano word, the nanostructured foam, which gave us the world's highest power battery and fast charge long before anybody else was doing it. And I was looking for something to do. Paul called me and said, hey, I want you to take a look at this. And if you like it, I'd like you to help me come commercialize this. And so I looked at it, and it was nano. They had this nanostructured foam that enabled high power and fast charge. And it was made with electroplating, which is a 150-year-old manufacturing technique. And it was a practical yet innovative twist on using a very long existing technology to make something in the battery space. And so that's how we get started. And that was in 2010. We've grown a lot since then, but that was the genesis of how we got to where we are today.
Well, and that may lead me to ask about your direct plate and structure pour technology, which I know we're diving right into the weeds, the technical weeds. But, when you mentioned that, I didn't know if that's where you were going. So I don't know if you want to start there. I understand it's a very technical subject, but I think it's what helps distinguish your company.
Well, I think anything in the battery space you can talk about qualitatively. It's really simple. It's the details that are really complicated. And so this nanostructured foam that we were doing, we were looking for something for a trademark. And I actually said, well, it's structured and it has pores. So we put them together as a placeholder. That's how we invented the name, and it just kind of stuck. So, that's kind of like naming your dog. But that was where we started. And that would give us fast charge. And it's just a foam that was made first by the university. We licensed it from the university, worldwide license, no geographic or fields of use restrictions. It was made by just using a traditional battery process, tape casting, to use sacrificial particles. And then we electroplated through that, washed the particles out. And then we had this nanostructure foam, which we would use as the current collector of the battery. So instead of having a mesh that we tape cast the battery structure on top of, we electroplated the active materials in and throughout that. And it gave us really high surface area, which is where the world's highest power and all those things came from. That's really hard to do. We were very focused early in the company until about from 2010 to 2014 on very high power systems. There's not a lot of large markets in high power. And so in about 2014, we were initially working with Samsung in the electronic space. And they said, high power and fast charge is really nice. It's pretty cool. But, the world's moving to EVs, and everything in the electronic space needs more and more runtime and more power. So we really think you need to focus on high energy density and fast charge. And we said, well, at that point, maybe we should pivot a little bit. And that's when we developed a direct plate process. And so up to that time, we were electroplating in water. That's the way electroplating has been done for 150 years. But, lithium and water don't get along too well. That causes problems with lithium batteries. So all of our lithium that we were using, we were doing in a second process. And at that time, I said, it would be really cool if we could do the lithium in the electroplating bath. So why don't we try to do a solvent that's not water? And, there have been some people exploring using battery electrolyte, which are organic solvents. And I said, well, aluminum refinement's done in molten salts. That's a molten salt electroplating. So why don't we try to see if we can find a combination of salts that melts low enough that it's easy to handle, that we can dissolve our starting materials in it and use that. And that's what we did. And that's where we started. Kind of a simple idea that really grew. We just happened to be in the right place, right time, and had an idea that turned out to really have legs. And now that's really kind of our dominant thing, because we can grow all of these different lithiated transition metal oxides, which is most of the commercial battery materials today, through this electroplating process. And so we're actually synthesizing and depositing the material in one step. So that makes us skip a lot of steps, and we get some structures that give us some really cool other battery properties. And so from about 2014 to 2017, we were really just developing batteries based on that. We still had the foam. We didn't put it on the positive electrode, the cathode, because there's really no way to put holes all the way throughout it and still have enough material to have high energy density. So we moved it over to the anode, where we could use it on silicon, where it became an advantage, because silicon anodes, their Achilles heel is that the material swells incredibly to the point that it'll actually break the electrode. And the micro cracking that happens is why it's taken a long time to get that commercialized. But our swelling was being accommodated in this porous material. And so we could use a much higher amount of pure silicon, up to 20-25%, where graphite silicon hybrids, which is prevalently in use today, usually top out around 5-6% before the cracking really kills the cycle life. And so we had a way to make the silicon anode a much higher energy density from a practical perspective. And then as we were electroplating this material, what we realized is that we had something that was actually, through playing games with the structure, we had high power on the cathode too, higher than you could get in a powder-based system that is what is used today. But we had skipped all of the binders, we'd skipped the conductive additives, and since we were throwing out the material that didn't participate actively, we actually had a really high energy density on both sides and still maintained a lot of the power. So we had high energy, high power. Turns out it's a really safe system. So we had a range of properties that a lot of big companies were really interested in: high energy, high power, fast charge. We kept the fast charge, safety, all in the same battery. And that's really what we were working off of. And, we had some nice advantages there early. And because we were early and it sounded too good to be true, we kind of went into a semi-stealth mode. Had been some announcements originally from the university that got very broadly publicized, like a lot of battery stuff did, especially back in that time around the 2011 timeframe. And so the structure port technology had been advertised. It was in NBC Nightly News, 60 Minutes, Green Car Congress, all of the normal websites, Wired and BBC. And so there was a huge hype wave like there is typically. And because of that, the first year to 2 years of the company, I spent on the phone with CTOs of Fortune 500 companies going, when can you get me a sample? And I'm like, dude, we're years away. And that's not a good conversation. So I was like, I don't want anybody else to know about this until I can hand them a battery and say, don't believe me, just test it.
Yeah.
And that, and because of my experience in the nanotechnology space, I'm really anti-hype, because in the end, it's counterproductive. And I think that's what's happened right now in the battery space, is that we just bottomed out in the hype curve. So we just kind of went semi-stealth and just worked on developing it with companies. It's all been business to business. I made the decision in 2018 that we weren't going to jump into the EV space like everybody else. We decided to stay with the traction that we had in the military and electronics, because we had this emerging technology where we were recreating the manufacturing process. In addition, it was really the same materials. It was a new way to make it. They created some really cool structures with new battery. And I thought, man, that's hard enough to get people to adopt without going into an emerging market. So emerging technology, emerging market, risk squared, it was just too much. So we just decided to stay where we were. And now that the thing is now seeming like it's going to go into the last part of the hype curve, which is just steady growth. We've been working with a lot of the automotive companies, but as we started going through that development process, we found the last core technology, which is, I told you in the beginning that we kind of thought this was similar to aluminum refinement. So we knew that chemistry electroplating is a refinement process, which means we did not need battery grade materials to make a good battery. And, had no idea at the time, number one, how far down the refinement chain we could go. And also that, this geopolitical situation between China and the Western world was going to wind up where China had a chokehold on refined materials. And so when it turns out we don't need refined materials to make our batteries. And so we've really tried to position the company. I told you that, the premise of the company is to help the country to really do something. We knew that we didn't need it for our batteries, but during the COVID period when we were looking at that, we weren't quite quick enough, like I said, to get into the automotive space, the EVs. And, decisions had been made about the initial manufacturing in the United States. Most of that was with the South Korean auto companies. So we said, well, if we're going to make a difference, we need to supply what they need, not, just push our technology at people. So what can we do in the upstream space that could also help? Can we adapt our technology to not just make battery electrodes, but also make some of the starting materials? And that also turned out to work really well. And then to add insult to injury, it works really well for recycling too. So we got all of these things that we got out there that have a lot of potential where we really think we can really impact the space, but we, like all of the small battery companies, really have to focus on getting through that hurdle into manufacturing, which I think is one of the central problems in the United States today. Sure. To really have a robust industry. And so we're really focused on getting our electronic materials, cobalt-based LCO, into the electronic space. And we're doing that as a component supplier of electrodes, and then making boutique cells in first the military space. And then also it's very well adapted to the drone space, like the eVTOLs and the air taxis.
Well, why don't I jump in there because you've gone through a lot. So let's start piecing through it a little bit because you mentioned the importance of energy density and, fast charging and safety are three things that you, I think, walk through with your technology. And there's the thermal runaway risk anytime you're dealing with lithium ions. As I think about one of the safety issues, fast charging, everybody wants fast charging, whether it's an EV or any other application. And then the energy density issue, which again, I guess I've viewed that as through the lens of the EV space, but it sounds like your focus, at least initially, might not be there, but more on defense applications. I know you've gotten some grants as well. So why don't you just start with where's the space that we're talking about where you guys are working with other companies and where you see this great technology, where you see the applications?
What we've tried to do is match our current manufacturing economies of scale with the market size so that we can grow with those, kind of wet our teeth in smaller markets, if you will, and then start to address larger markets as we move forward. So we decided to, like I said, stay in the military. I told you I'm passionate about making sure the soldiers have the best equipment that they have. So we're talking about cells that go into packs for radios and night vision goggles and things like that. We've been working with the Army and some of the Army Tier 1 pack suppliers in that regard. And then we've been working with a lot of the large electronics manufacturers in wearables and, kind of moving into the cell phone space. So the typical, and when you talk about energy density there, we're talking about every generation of new phone or new watch or whatever the wearable happens to be has more, they try to cram more and more in. So there's more energy usage and they want to last the same amount of time. So the energy density has to grow there as well. And that market continues to grow robustly. And so it's been a good thing for us because there's a good compounded growth there. It just got eclipsed by the EV space and everybody kind of forgot about it in the rush and the EV gold rush. So that's what we wanted to do. We've been working now in the automotive space. It's just we decided not to target that as our initial market. You got a 4-year development cycle. It's a different chemistry that they're interested in. And, we felt like one of the mistakes that a lot of small companies make, especially when there's as much potential as what, I mentioned in our technology, that we just needed to put a stake in the ground, get that moving, get that commercialized. And then our second generation, we wanted to target into the EV space. And so we're doing the early work with that now with many of the large companies. So in the next 2 to 3 years, as we're actually finishing the scale up in production of our cobalt-based materials for electronics, we're doing the R&D and the early scale up on the nickel-based materials for the automotive space. And then in about 2 years, we're going to actually move. We're staying in the commercial materials. We just have a better way of making them that's more cost effective. And it's cost effective because we're skipping steps, but we're also removing a lot of the energy from those skip steps, which means we have a much better carbon footprint. And so those are things that all just kind of line up in this too good to be true kind of area. And then later on, as we get into that, we'll catch the low end of the EVs with the iron-based materials and then also move into grid storage. So we're trying to grow into the area, and then we're doing the same thing not only in the market size, but what we're attacking. So our electroplating process, these molten salts, there's no organic solvent in them, so there's no outgassing. So, we're not adding to global warming from emissions, which means we don't have to recapture the organic solvent, which is a huge energy cost. But in addition to that, our only byproduct of this lithium cobalt oxide process is that we make highly pure cobalt metal as a byproduct. An electroplating reaction, there's 2 electrodes, which means there always has to be 2 reactions. Reaction on one side, which we're using, is lithium cobalt oxide. The reaction on the other is refined cobalt metal. So there are some things there that we can do. We're going to go into the EV space first, not with our NMC electrodes, but with some of the precursor materials into the cathode active materials.
Well, that's an interesting point. And so let's just talk about a couple of issues there. One, I know you mentioned the lithium that you are able to use, which has an impact on supply chain in a positive way for the United States. But then also talk about the cobalt issue, because on previous podcast episodes, we've mentioned that a little bit. And there are some issues with how cobalt is typically extracted and mined, et cetera, and some real controversy, I think, around that. And so I was wondering if you could talk about it, because my ears perked up when you said one of our end products is cobalt. So I'm curious about all of that.
When we first got started, we were really just focused on the battery technology itself and weren't really paying that much attention to the raw materials. But then, as we got done with our first set of R&D prototypes and really were ready to start looking at scale up, we really started to think more about the raw materials themselves. So, that was around the 2017 timeframe. We did start with lithium, but, we've been really focused on batteries for electronics and drones, a lot of which are the cobalt. So we really started delving into those raw materials as a source of supply starting about that timeframe. So we've been looking at it for quite a while. Now, as most people know, about 70% of the world's supply of cobalt right now comes from the DRC. And there have been some concerns in that area about domestic abuses, and whether or not those are the reality or not is independent of the point. But in the United States, when those concerns started to become more prevalent, the United States government and other players in the United States basically said, we don't really want to take this from there because of these perceived abuses. And it all went to China. And so now, if you look at it, China has about 70 to 75% of the world's cobalt metal refining capabilities. And then if you want to actually use that in the battery space, whether it be for LCO or NMC, you really have to go through that chokehold in China. And so we think it's really important for us that we can actually use those materials in a non-refined form and avoid that Chinese refinement chokehold. As a matter of fact, now that the people in the U.S. government and decision makers are looking at that, they're like, yeah, okay, so we understand what's going on in the DRC. We understand now that there are actual sources which don't have those problems. And so let's use those. The fact that we can buy imported cobalt first, refine that in the United States, whether it be for high purity alloy uses or as precursor materials into a battery, that allows us to completely bypass that Chinese chokehold. But beyond that, I think one of the things that's a really important point for us is that we can actually take very low purity grades that you may have domestically. As a matter of fact, anywhere you have copper or nickel, you always have cobalt. A lot of times those just wind up in the tailings because they're not at purities that are economic to extract. And our process is the single-step process that can directly draw the cobalt out of the system. And so we can make it profitable at those low purities. And then that increases tremendously the total amount of cobalt that's practically available to use in the world. So not only are we able to use cobalt that's refined from other sources, but at the same time, we can actually greatly increase the abundance that's available and provide some stability in the world for cobalt and some of those other metals using our technique.
That's fantastic. And that's the most positive development that I've heard about with respect to cobalt. There's a recent book out called Cobalt Red, I believe it's called, and it's about, and you may have read it, John, and it's about the terrible situation in the Congo and how the cobalt is extracted. So that, to me, is a great development. And you're right. You're helping the United States and its supply chain, but you're really helping the world because it's an untenable situation. I just get on my soapbox for 30 seconds. I've dealt with the electric part of the energy industry for a long time, and people who listen to the podcast know I'm more on the electric power space. But that being said, the energy world, that's why I got into the storage issue, because if you're going to firm up renewables, so to speak, one of the ways to do that is with grid scale storage. And then we got into the whole EV space and other applications and all that. It's sort of grown from there. But one of the things that I'm always concerned about is we're going to replace one set of externalities that are negative, carbon emissions, et cetera, other kinds of emissions, I hope we don't just simply replace them with another set of negative externalities. And
Yeah.
one of them is the cobalt mining, which is a concern.
In that same philosophical vein, I first got exposed to this. I'm a materials guy. That's what I did in the Air Force. And so we were doing our stuff that was needed for the airplanes. And I saw a presentation by a guy who was a Canadian miner. And so they had in their leach fields, they had copper and it was killing the fish downstream. And they greatly resisted cleaning it up and they got forced to clean it up. And then when they cleaned it up, they actually found out that they had profitable copper there. And then the story he was telling was, don't resist it. And so, I strongly believe in being a good steward, no matter what we're doing. Every time you start a new industry, if it's a physical object, it's materials, most of them get mined. We just have to ensure that they're doing what they need to do to clean it up and then to put the environment back the way it was when it ended. And I think every time you move into a new one, just like you say, that's the real challenge, is because I believe that you can do that economically and many times profitably to make sure that you finish that whole life cycle.
Oh, it's fantastic. All right, let me just shift gears for a second. So you're in Kettering, Ohio, which is near Dayton. How did you end up settling in Ohio?
I'm a Texas boy, born and raised. And so, yeah, they say the thing, you can take the boy out of Texas, but you can't take Texas out of the boy. My accent's mostly gone to me, but everybody's telling me I still have an accent. But I did my undergraduate at Texas A&M, was in the Corps of Cadets, joined the Air Force to see the world. They sent me to Dayton, Ohio, and I never left. And so we started the company in Champaign, Illinois, but I've lived in Dayton, Ohio for almost 35 years now. And so, I always expected that when we started in the incubator at the University of Illinois, that there'd be some company that grabbed a hold of this and said, we need you outside the gates of our facility, and that we'd be forced to move somewhere. And so when that didn't happen, I moved the company home.
My daughter went to college in Ohio, so I was curious. But
I know it's a great place to live. I love it. It's subtle, but it's a good place.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been a great conversation, and I hope the audience has a good sense now for Xerion and xerionbattery.com to learn more about it. I think getting into where your space is right now, so to speak, and where you want to go, I mean, just my pet interest, I guess my question would be, I think you mentioned it in passing, the grid scale possibility in the future. Just if you could speak to that for a minute, because I think that's a lot of our audience kind of comes into this battery conversation through that grid scale space. And I don't know if you see what kind of role you see for your company potentially down the road.
I think it's going to be the largest one in a long time. And like I said, we were trying to, grid scale was a little farther out than EV in terms of really large implementations. But we've been actually working with energy companies since the inception of the company. And, the things that I've learned in the grid scale space is that you need a 20-year life. Everything in the utility is based on an ROI out to 20 years. You don't care about weight, but you care a lot about cycle life to get to that 20-year point. And there are materials that have done that. But in the end, the over-abiding more than anything else is cost. And that's what we've been able to do more than anything else in the battery field. We had better battery performance, and that's what we've lived on. But in the end, especially as we got through that hype curve where it was like energy density at all, no matter what it costs, now it's like cost is the most important consideration. I say we're skipping all the steps. We've actually been able to go now from mine gate materials to a finished electrode in one step. And that removes like 14 major commercial steps. And that's the CapEx, the energy, the labor. Out of all those steps, 2 full complete commercial plants are skipped. But that drastically reduces the cost. And so we've shown with our LCO materials, which can also have long cycle life, that we can reduce the cost somewhere around the area of LFP, the iron-based materials. And people have asked me, well, if you could do that and you have twice the energy density at the same cost, why would you want to do LFP? I said, because then I'm going to turn around and do the same thing with the iron-based materials. I'm going to make them half the cost, and then it's really going to open up the energy space. And so that work is still to be done. We've identified theoretically that we can do the iron-based materials. To be clear, it's not done yet. We haven't demonstrated it. That's work that we're starting on next year, because we're going through the nickel-based material R&D first to try to keep that discipline as we grow so we don't lose focus. Because the goal is to have a sustained impact over a long time. So we expect to be all in on the grid scale space with the demonstrations starting 2 to 3 years from now and then becoming a majority of our business over the next 10 years.
Well, we'll have to definitely stay in touch on that because I think that the opportunity is just enormous. It's obviously, look, it's my biggest interest in this, but I'm interested in all of it and the applications that you talked about today and the EVs. But yeah, that's my background. And so the grid scale piece is always of special interest to me. So I appreciate you walking through that. And I think, as you mentioned, it's a huge opportunity because of the different policy goals and just the needs for the country in terms of new capacity. You know, you got a lot of states that really just want renewables. And what are you going to do if it's not dispatchable? So what are the things?
Yeah, exactly. You have to have some kind of storage. And I'm kind of an all of the above kind of guy. But my thing is, and people are like, well, so you're saying we shouldn't use oil. I'm saying, no, we shouldn't save our oil to make plastics because it's really expensive to make plastics out of anything but oil. And if you have something that's plentiful, then you might as well start developing it now. I had the privilege to work with Rick Smiley, who won the Nobel Prize for carbon buckyballs. And when he first got the Nobel Prize, he said, I want to see what I'm going to use this bully pulpit for. And he listed out the top 10 world problems and then realized that 7 of the 10 could be solved with cheap, abundant energy. So he went through nuclear, he went through solar, he went through wind, wave. And in the end, almost every energy source is derived from the sun. So solar is the only sustainable way to get there. I think we still have a long way to go before it could replace things. You got all the intermittency, which is why you need the whole balance of systems, you know, and like you said, the sun doesn't shine at night. So all of those situations you have to find energy storage solutions for. And I don't know if batteries are the final solution, but I know they're the first solution.
Well, that's a good way to put it. And I think they're part of the picture. And for the record, I think I've said this before, I'm an all of the above guy too. I have a battery storage podcast. I work with renewable developers. I work with integrated utility. I work with all different kinds of companies. I've come to the conclusion that if we're going to balance affordability, sustainability, keeping the lights on and dispatching the system, I mean, you go to the control room for some of these regions and the guys in the control room, they have a really difficult job. And so let's make their job a little easier with more dispatchable resources. And so, anyway,
absolutely.
Yeah. And so we're on the same page there, but I think that these storage technologies will play a big role going forward, almost no matter what. So in any event, maybe we should wrap up there, but appreciate your time today. Really appreciate the conversation and let us know if you want to come back on the program. I'll give you the last word. What should potential customers, people who are interested in working with you, what advice would you give them? What should they do?
The last thing that I think, as we build the national domestic battery space, the government, there's been a lot of work. I know you've had a few podcasts about the BIL and stuff like that. It's a big hurdle to get the domestic energy started. And I think the mistake that the government's making, that's my mic drop, is they're trying to fund only projects that are bankable. And my comment is, if it's bankable, go to the banks. The government needs to be funding things in the valley of death to get them through that into manufacturing, because we don't need to be going down the traditional institutional 10x home runs. We need to be playing Moneyball, to quote the movie, where we get a lot of these technologies that are down on the vine for lack of money, that are great technologies. We need to get them through that process so then natural selection can pick the best technologies.
Great thoughts. Great thought. I love the Moneyball reference, one of my favorite sports movies. So appreciate that as well. Well, again, great to have you on, John, and we will leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks.
Copyright Troutman Pepperlock, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman does not make any representations or warranties, expressed or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper Locke. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.